We spend all year talking about the showcase of the Immortals, the grandest stage of them all, the boyhood and girlhood dreams coming true. But what happens when the immortal trip over their own feet? What happens when the grandest stage collapses under the weight of terrible booking, massive egos, and Jim Ross in a toga? Welcome to Pro Wrestling Escape. Today, we are not celebrating the masterpieces. We're going to dig through the trash to rank my top five worst WrestleManias of all time. And before we start going through the garbage, let's look at a masterpiece for this week in WWE history. Specifically, March 23rd, 1997. That gave us WrestleMania 13. While the overall card was a one-match show, that one match changed the industry forever, in my opinion. Bret the Hitman Hart versus Stone Cold Steve Austin in a submission match. This was the masterclass of the double turn. Bret walked in the hero and left the villain, while Stone Cold passed out in a pool of his own blood, refusing to quit, and became the biggest anti-hero in wrestling history. Ken Shamrock was a special guest referee. It was a violent match. It was psychological storytelling, I think, at its peak, and it officially lit the fuse for the Attitude Era that we know and love. All right, it is time to get into our main event. It is the top five worst WrestleManias of all time. Again, this is purely opinionated based on what I saw originally, and then went back and watched about 8 or 9 WrestleManias recently just to kind of see. I had an idea of which would be in my top five, but then I narrowed it down from about 8 or 9 to about five. So let's see what you think. Kicking us off at number five, I have WrestleMania 27. This happened in 2011. It wasn't a WrestleMania to me. It was a 4-hour, kind of like a full price commercial for WrestleMania 28. So they're already promoting WrestleMania during a WrestleMania. Now, the absurdity of this one to me was Michael Cole versus Jerry the King Lawler, which got an unbelievable 13 minutes and about 45 seconds of ring time. And then you add in the entrances and the post match reversing of the decision by the anonymous Raw GM at the time. And it took up almost a half hour of the show, which is kind of mind boggling. Meanwhile, the United States Championship match at that time was Sheamus versus Daniel Bryan. And that was actually bumped to the pre show dark match, if you remember, to make room for this Jersey Shore star, Snooki. That's right, I said Snooki, who was also 1-0 in WrestleMania. And then you had the main event, which it was kind of a disaster. Unfortunately, it was The Miz versus John Cena. The Miz suffered a legit severe concussion after taking a tackle over the barricade onto the concrete. And he has stated numerous times throughout interviews over the years since that WrestleMania that he remembers absolutely nothing about main eventing WrestleMania, which absolutely sucks. The match ended in a double count out, only for The Rock to restart it, hit a rock bottom on Cena, and hand Miz the win just to set up the next year's angle. Just not a big fan of promoting the next PLE, especially if you're on one of the big four, such as WrestleMania, and promoting for the next WrestleMania. That's why it's at my number five. Number four, this was WrestleMania 11, 1995. Now, this to me was probably the lowest point for WWE for the new generation era. I think financially and creatively. And WWE was really hurting at that time, bleeding money, and Vince was basically throwing Hail Marys at mainstream celebrities and athletes to get media attention. Now, we still do that today, but on a much different scale. We have obviously plenty of stars that we don't need the celebrities, but WrestleMania now is becoming such a kind of Super Bowl where we try to get the casuals to come in and watch. So now I know we can be tribal at times where us wrestling fans that watch it year round, day in and day out, we kind of don't like that. I mean, I'm kind of over it. I get it's not going to be your normal PLE, and I get that. I'm just hoping that matches themselves continue to hopefully just be good. Now, going back to WrestleMania 11, we had a roster crisis at the time. It was very thin, and it included matches with an aged King Kong Bundy, Kama. Remember, he stole the Undertaker's urn and melted it into a chain. And then we had the Blue Brothers. That's right, the Blue Brothers. Go back on Wikipedia, look them up. Now, the main event on paper sounded awesome. You had Shawn Michaels and Diesel. Um, that you would think would put on a fantastic championship match, but pump the brakes there. This was actually relegated to the mid card. And if you remember the main event, that was NFL linebacker Lawrence Taylor main eventing with and against Bam Bam Bigelow. Now, to Bam Bam Bigelow's credit, he worked a miracle, I thought, to make LT look pretty solid in the ring. But having an active, really, any NFL, NBA, doesn't matter, close to your biggest show of the year, that's not a tag match, proved how little faith I think WWE had in its own wrestlers at the time, and also to just really Vince wanting to get more eyes on the product, doing whatever it took. If it meant taking away from the current wrestlers on the roster, then that's what it was. So really, it was not a great WrestleMania. If you go back and watch it, the pacing is just that just was not good. And yeah, that's new generation era had some rough WrestleManias. Number three, this is in 2016. This was WrestleMania 32. I remember exactly where I was. I was living in Chicago at the time. And this was a marathon, I thought, of misery. At the time, WWE was really pushing to break the indoor attendance record at AT&T Stadium. They claimed over 100,000, but through paid attendance, but really it was closer to 80,000 when they went back to really take a legit count. And at the time, the roster was decimated by injuries, unfortunately, which, I mean, it's really not their fault. They tried to do what they could, but I wouldn't think stretching out the duration of WrestleMania when you're missing John Cena, Seth Rollins, Randy Orton, and Sting would be the way to go. This went out to be almost 6 hours if you include the pre show. Now, here we had kind of like a wasted potential. At the time, Dean Ambrose and Brock had a pretty good feud. And at this WrestleMania, they had booked them in a street fight, heavily promoted. But at the same time, Brock Lesnar was actually secretly, I don't know if secretly, but he was preparing for his UFC 200 return. And supposedly, the word was he refused to do anything dangerous at the time, resulting in a massively underwhelming match. Go back and watch it. Let me know what you think. And then you had what I like to call the ego strokes. You had the League of Nations beat the New Day purely. So Shawn Michaels, Mick Foley, and Stone Cold to come out and hit their finishers. Now, nostalgic pops, I'm always one for that. But then The Rock went on to spend 15 minutes with a flamethrower to set up a 6-second match against Eric Rowan. Yes, go back and watch that. 6 seconds. Why am I promoting this WrestleMania? Because I think it's good for people that have not seen it to understand why I'm going on a rant on this. Now, the main event for WrestleMania 27 was Roman Reigns versus Triple H. Just agonizing. I'm sorry, that was not WrestleMania 27. The match itself was 27 minutes. See, that's how boring it is talking about this WrestleMania. And so the crowd was so hostile at that time for the Reigns Triple H match that WWE had to lower the stadium microphone volumes on the broadcast just to hide the boos. Again, 27 minutes of that is absolutely insane, especially when you have two names like Roman Reigns and Triple H at WrestleMania 32, not 27. WrestleMania 32 was my number three. Again, sorry for that hiccup. Moving on to number two. The number two worst WrestleMania for me was 1986, which is WrestleMania 2. Now, I did put a video on my Instagram recently, kind of diving into for really for the newer fans or the younger fans at the time that weren't around for WrestleMania 2 or didn't know the history behind it. But that was an absolute logistical and and technological nightmare, really. And I kind of covered it on my Instagram reel as well. But this is where Vince McMahon wanted to outdo WrestleMania 1 by broadcasting from three separate arenas and cities on a Monday night. It wasn't even on the weekend. It was on a Monday night. They were at the Nassau Coliseum in New York, Rosemont Horizon at the time in Chicago, and the LA Sports Arena in Los Angeles. Now, because it's three different arenas, the pacing was completely dead. Fans in the arenas were forced to watch two-thirds of the WrestleMania show on massive projection screens as only each location got 4 matches and just led to what I would assume would be restless and angry crowds. You're there to watch 4 matches and then, oh, we got to go to Chicago and here you're sitting in LA and oh my goodness. So, and then at one point, I can't remember which location she was at, but Susan St. James was brought in as a celebrity guest commentator and gave what many consider the worst commentary performance in wrestling history, constantly repeating uh and showing really not much knowledge or zero knowledge of the product. Is that her fault? No, Vince probably didn't prep her or give her enough knowledge to, speak on it and just say, "Hey, we need a big name." Boom, here you go. Vince has a track record of that. Again, I really appreciate what Vince McMahon has done for the company. I mean, you'd only grow if you actually take a lot of risk, and boy did he. Also, remember at WrestleMania 2, we had the boxing match. This was Mr. T versus Roddy Piper in a boxing match ending in a DQ when Piper just decided to body slam him and end it. Really, it was kind of a terrible climax to what at the time was a pretty massive feud. So go back and watch that. I will say the opening WrestleMania 2 jingle or theme, it was actually pretty catchy. It was very 80s. I actually kind of liked it, but outside of that, it's pretty hard to watch. Now, before we get into number one, I'm going to go into my honorable mention. And I know some of you are going to scratch your heads on this one, but hear me out. I have WrestleMania 2000, which is also known as WrestleMania 16. Now, this is from an era that we usually praise, the Attitude Era. WrestleMania 2000, for a company that was just white hot at the time, the card was baffling. There was only one traditional one on one wrestling match on the entire card. Seriously. And it was Terry Runnels versus the cat and a cat fight. Yeah, yeah. Middle school aged me at the time thought that was awesome. But looking back at it now, here I am 37, it's like, oof, okay. Not only was that the only one-on-one match, it was a cat fight. Again, Attitude Era, you had to be there to believe it and to understand it. But everything else on that card was either a tag match, a triangle match, fatal four-way. And remember, the main event was a McMahon in every corner. Triple H with Stephanie, Rock with Vince, Big Show with Shane, and Foley with Linda. And it turned the biggest match of the year into an episode of what I thought would be Succession. I don't know if you guys watched that show on HBO Match, rather than just a wrestling showcase. So again, that is my honorable mention. Now, number one. Any final thoughts? Any final guesses? My number one worst WrestleMania of all time is WrestleMania 9, happened in 1993. To me, this came off as the ultimate ego trip and kind of the ugliest show in company history. Now, one cool thing about it was held outdoors during the day at Caesar's Palace. I am a huge mark when it comes to outdoor events for wrestling. It just to me it looks awesome on TV, and I'm sure being there as long as it's not too hot, it's actually pretty sick. Now I know you don't see all the pyro and the lights, whatever. However, outside events, think of WCW back in the day with Nitro. They used to do what is now Hollywood Studios, MGM Graham, and that was pretty cool too. So going back to WrestleMania 9, this is when Jim Ross made his WWE wearing a toga. Seriously, go watch it. Now we had the Undertaker streak. The Undertaker faced Giant Gonzalez in what is easily the worst match of the streak. It is the only wrestling match Taker won by disqualification because Giant Gonzalez used a rag soaked in chloroform to knock him out. Yep, chloroform. Now, that's not even going on to mention what I call the Hogan robbery. Now, if you remember, Bret Hart was supposed to be the new face, or supposed to be the face of the new generation. He defended the WWE title against massive Yokozuna. Mr. Fuji threw salt in Bret's eyes, costing him the belt. Then Hulk Hogan, who had already wrestled a tag match earlier, marched out to quote unquote check on Bret Hart. Mr. Fuji randomly challenged Hogan on the spot. Hogan ducked the salt, hit a leg drop, and won the title in 22 seconds to close the show, completely castrating Bret Hart and Yokozuna's heat just to stroke the Hulkster's ego one last time before he left the company. All right. It is time for the Crowd Speaks segment. I put the poll out, I think last week on Pro Wrestling Escape on Instagram and asking you guys to name your worst WrestleMania. Now, you guys really got into the history books. I asked for your worst takes, and honestly, some of you chose violence, which that's what these top 5 worst lists are about. So thank you for doing that. First up, we have Metis XIV, which I'm assuming is 14, says WrestleMania 30 is up there because the rest of the card was awful. I like this take. So you're saying Daniel Bryan miracle wasn't enough to save that entire show? The streak ending with The Undertaker did suck the oxygen out of the room for at least an hour, but I see where you're coming from. It was kind of a frustrating one to watch. Next up, we have That's Just Chris underscore. Chris kept it short. He said WrestleMania 34. Now, if I remember, I go back and remember it was kind of painful. You had AJ versus Nakamura. It didn't really click. And then you had the main event. Yeah, my soul kind of left my body during that one too. So WrestleMania 34, man, when you have so many WrestleManias at this point, they're not all going to be great, and I get that. So again, purely our opinions, and I love that everybody has such different answers. That's the beauty of this. Next up, I had Donnie Demigod. Donnie wanted to say WrestleMania 27, which was carried by Taker versus Triple H. Spot on. Those two at that time were out there playing chess, while the rest of the card was, I think, playing in the sandbox. It was basically a one-match show. Next up, we had Falls Count Anywhere. Falls Count Anywhere brought up WrestleMania 36, the Pandemic Mania. But he went on to say it's hard to be mad at it, but watching wrestling in a silent warehouse felt like watching a movie with the sound off. Very valid. I do think I do have to give, it's tough. COVID was a tough time for all involved. And then when you boil it down to specifically to wrestling and WWE, they did what they could. You had the Thunderdome. And then, it was, being stuck at home during COVID. It was at least entertaining, something to watch, but I appreciate for what it was. All right, next up we had alt underscore wrestling underscore worlds. We want to say 93 through 1993 through 1996 WrestleManias were all bad. Now to me, 93 and 95 are a struggle, sure, but I have a hard time disrespecting WrestleMania 10. Call it nostalgic. I remember watching it as a kid with my dad. You had Brett versus Owen. You had the ladder match between Razor Ramon and Shawn Michaels. I I agree with 93 and 95. 96, I'm going to disagree on that. But yeah, New Generation had some really tough moments there. Next up, we have Malguli. He went on to say WrestleMania 27 is the absolute worst. It is the consensus king of the bad Mania list. When the main event is basically just a 20-minute commercial for next year's main event, the fans lose. Boom. Spot on. Couldn't agree more with that. And finally, we have another one. We have J. Will Duel. He goes with WrestleMania 9 because of the Roman theme. The togas, the camels, and Hogan winning the belt in 20 seconds. I agree. It is pure kind of cringe to me. So I will say you win old school hater of the day for that one, especially calling out the Roman theme. I should have thought of that. That was pretty obvious. Now, if you survived this trip down memory lane, hit the follow button if you haven't already on Spotify. Go ahead and leave us a star rating. I'm not going to say, oh, give us a 5-star rating. Give me a star rating what you believe is true. And just make sure that you are following at Pro Wrestling Escape on Instagram for our weekly Trivia Tuesdays. I try to do weekly podcasts. They are tough with the time crunch, the full-time job, and young kids. I know we'll get to it. I promise I will try to get better with that. Now, we will see you either next week or the following, and we will just go down memory lane again, but this time for the top 5 best WrestleManias of all time. Until then, keep escaping.